Greetings friends. Thanks for stopping by for a visit. If you enjoy the video, please subscribe.
I decided to create an account to tell this story of an experience I had while on board an aircraft carrier far from the coast of California in the Pacific. First off, I am relaying information and supporting circumstances. I did not see a UFO personally. However, it is an interesting story. I am intentionally going to be vague about certain specifics just to protect my identity, although this information was never told to be kept secret and was widespread. During a 1 or 2 month workup on an aircraft in the Pacific Ocean, we encountered a UFO. For those that are unfamiliar, workups are training exercises in preparation for deployment. So, the ship will deploy for anywhere from 2 to 8 weeks and let the pilots get aircraft carrier experience. So, we are on a routine workup in the Pacific Ocean. However, this workup involved multiple carriers and battleships in a rather large exercise. I have zero recollection of the time in the workup that the encounter occurred, but I believe it was a few weeks in. I was attached to an F-18 squadron and worked in a technical capacity, as opposed to working on the flight deck. For 3 days in a row, an operations officer noticed an aircraft breaching our restricted airspace. The aircraft was traveling at a low speed at around 20,000 feet. The first 2 days the aircraft was observed, it disappeared from radar after a few minutes before being able to investigate. In preparation for this aircraft, the carriers had F-18s ready to scramble. On the third sighting, a formation of around 10, very rough guess, but it was a large group, F-18C and Ds scrambled to the location to investigate, including my commanding officer. This is where the story becomes hard to believe and almost silly to tell. According to the pilots and confirmed by a friend in Intel, when they encountered the aircraft it had disappeared from sight. However, there was a large disruption in the ocean below and it was assumed that the aircraft crashed. So, the strike group circled the area and inspected the scene. Okay, crazy part now, an object that was described by multiple pilots and a friend in Intel as resembled a very large tic-tac. Sounds like the ultimate troll job, I know. So, the tic-tac oval object lifted from the water. Out of fear or impulse, I have no idea, our pilots decided to engage the object. After lifting from the water and sitting briefly, the object flew at a speed that none of the pilots had ever encountered. It was just gone. The incident was not cloaked in secrecy. The entire carrier was buzzing with rumors. I was not able to see the com/NAV actual flight recording, so I was very skeptical. Things get dull in the middle of the ocean and it is not uncommon for troll jobs. So I wasn't exactly sold. That night in the berthing I asked a very close friend in Intel if he could confirm the legitimacy of the film. Without speaking, he gestured that it was correct. So, my skepticism began to fade and that next day a group of individuals were called onto the carrier and they retrieved all the tapes. I can confirm they called onto the ship, but the seizure of tapes came from people that work in those shops. Years later I had practically forgotten this experience and I was watching TV at a friend's house. The show was about UFOs and some Russian pilots were describing an experience they had and they actually released the flight footage. The object that captured on film was shaped just like a tic-tac and moved faster than anything in existence. If someone can find a video or pic of that doc, much love. It was on History Channel years ago. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the read. I will try to answer any questions if anyone has any. I don't want to go into details about dates, ship name, my job, etc., although I don't think it matters. We weren't told to be quiet and it was pretty widespread, minus certain details I acquired through discussions.
The government monitors UFOs from Eglin Air Force Base in Fort Walton, Florida. There is a SCIF located on Eglin called Site C6. There is a mission statement written on the wall when you get inside the facility in gold letters that reads, We monitor all space activity, terrestrial and extraterrestrial, from planet Earth. The radar can track objects the size of a grapefruit 20,000 miles in space. So, the government knows where they come from and where they go once they get here. I was a military policeman in 2009 when I was fortunate enough to visit the facility, which is located about 15 miles deep inside the base. It has since been turned over to the U.S. Space Force. My entire unit was told when we got there, if we were patrolling with the Marine Patrol, that occasionally we would have to retrieve space junk out of the water. We all kind of laughed about it when we were told, and I forgot about it until my Air Force Security Forces counterpart asked me if I wanted to go to the site to take some food to the people working there. And I was shocked when I walked inside the facility and read the sentence on the wall. I can recall on 2 occasions when our leaders inexplicably made us go inside at night because something was flying around they didn't want us to see. I also observed unmarked white jet planes leaving the base. Our unit had 2 missions there because we were getting ready to deploy again overseas. First was marijuana eradication because Eglin is a huge base. Second was doing garrison security, working tandem with the Air Force Security Forces and contract security officers. It was one of the most interesting places I've ever served on in my 10-year military career. I served 4 years in the Marine Corps and 6 in the active Army and National Guard. You can actually Google Site C6. I was surprised it's in the public domain. It's one of those places the government tries to hide in plain sight. I had a UFO sighting when I was very young with my mother and sister. We all 3 observed a UFO on the ground in a field next to where we lived in Georgia in the late 1970s. I had forgotten about it until I visited Eglin and realized that we are not alone and that the government actually monitors them. It was shocking to me when I learned it was real. I had never spoken with my mother about our incident until a few months ago because I couldn't stop thinking about what I learned at Eglin. I came out as a whistleblower and have told some important people investigating this matter my story. I hope others come forward. What really piqued my interest was why does space junk just fall in and around Eglin Air Force Base and not fall in our backyard sometimes? I've heard rumors of the Air Force using EMP weapons in order to bait and bring UFOs/UAPs down, but I can't verify that, only what I observed directly. I've heard Chris Mellon mention Site C6's capabilities, but he never calls it by name. I knew what place he was referring to as soon as I heard him mention some of the United States radar capabilities in an interview. A former radar technician at the site said that the Air Force indeed tracked UFOs/UAPs from Site C6 when he was stationed there from 1981 to 1984, and during the Gulf Breeze sightings, according to people he knew that worked at the facility in the 90s.
1986, the classic TR-3B. I was 6 years old and with my mother and grandparents, driving home. It was completely dark, but I doubt it was very late. We might have been coming home from a revival at church or something. That I don't remember. What I do remember, my granddad was driving, and I was in the front passenger seat. My mom and grandma were in the back. We were almost to our house, pretty rural area of Appalachia, and I mean, less than a quarter mile. Our driveway was the next left on a gravel road. We had the radio on and I was prattling away about something to Granddad when he suddenly slowed way down, and I knew we weren't to the driveway yet, so I looked ahead to see if it was a deer or something. The road in front of us, right in front of us, was bathed in red light. I wasn't afraid, probably because I was so young, lol, but very curious. At that point anyway. I looked up to see what could be making that light. After all, we were driving through the woods, and the only sky visible was right above the road. It was very low down, I think, because it looked so huge. But you could tell it was a triangle because of the lights on each corner. They were white or yellow, not sure which, and dim relative to the center red light, which was very bright. It seemed like we sat there a long time because my granddad was not willing to drive under that red light. But probably only a couple minutes. Oddly, we couldn't hear the radio during that, it either turned off or something else was happening, but it was absolutely silent. I started to feel a little sick. It then began to move, very slowly, over us. My granddad just let it pass. I remember that red light passing over the windshield. Once it was just past us, he drove, very carefully, not too fast, the short distance home. I remember my mom nervously laughing when we parked, and I asked what kind of plane it was, and she just said she didn't know. I tend to give credence to the idea that some or all TR-3B type craft are reverse-engineered US Air Force tech, but who knows? I don't know, it was the strangest thing to see it standing still and how intense the silence was.
My father was in the Navy, and at one point we were stationed at a military base in Morocco near Sidi Yahia du Garb. It was pretty basic, like small-town America on a small base, mostly families in on base housing. School was on the base, as was the clinic and the Marine K-9 barracks. One night my father and I were on our way to a Cub Scout meeting, and were driving through a roundabout when we saw a number of people on the side of the road looking towards the school. They all seemed excited about something, so we pulled off and parked, and my father asked what was going on. There was a bright light in the distance over the school that was about the size of a full moon. I didn't really think much of it. We got back into the car and went to the meeting, and years later I started doing research on the base location and to see if anyone else had seen this bright light. As it turned out, a number of people had, including one couple who contacted the Shore Patrol, who came out to their residence, confiscated the film they took, and told them to never discuss it or it would affect their careers. I did some further digging and found some old websites from Navy retirees who talked about their time on the base, and a couple who also mentioned the sighting as well as other sightings at Kenitra Air Force Base. My father was in the last year of his life when I talked to him about what I had found. He said that the sighting we saw that night wasn't the first one. In fact, it happened on a regular basis around the giant communications array south of the base. Apparently UFOs would hover over the antenna for a bit before flying off, and the Marine K-9 units would occasionally fire on them until the base commander ordered them to stop or they would be billed for the bullets. During my digging around, I found out the small family base was a secret radio communications facility run by the NSA, and they used moon bounce antennas to bounce signals from Europe up to the moon that bounced off the surface and down to the eastern US.
Hey guys. I have a pretty weird story. It happened 4 years ago, and sometimes I just randomly think about it, but I haven't heard of / read any similar experiences, so I just kind of kept it to myself and my family. I'm not totally sure if this is the correct place for it, but here it goes. This is what happened. On July 31, 2014, I decided to do my very first solo overnighter at Shriner Peak near Mount Rainier. It was a weekday, and I ended up being the only one there. I hiked in 4.25 miles and set up my tent by the old lookout without the tent's rainfly so I could look up at the night sky. After the sun set, out of the corner of my eye, I could see something with a bright light. I look over and see not one, but 3 objects, very saucer-like, hovering not too high in the sky. They're hovering and making the same pattern over and over, all following each other in a line. At one point, they scatter and one hovers directly over my tent. They would come and go, hovering in different patterns, the same pattern for about an hour. All of this happened from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., pretty much sunset to sunrise. I was 23 at the time, and I am a female. Being alone was intimidating to begin with, and I expected to be freaked out by animal noises, but nothing like this. The entire night I laid frozen in fear. At the point when the thing hovered over my tent, I began to cry. I just felt stuck in this super weird / pretty freaky situation and really didn't know what to expect. When the sun began to rise shortly after 4 a.m., I threw everything into my pack and literally ran all the way down to my car. I drove to the ranger station to ask if they've been using drones, even though these were like no drones I've ever seen, and I sort of explained what I saw, but tried not to sound too crazy. They didn't really give me any information other than that there was a military base in the area. Now, I have no idea if that's relevant, but who knows. would be the best explanation that it was something military related. Anyway, if anyone has heard of / seen anything similar in the area, I'd love to hear / not feel like I'm crazy. Needless to say, that was my first and last solo overnighter.
This is my story. Cedar Springs, Michigan. About 2 weeks ago, as I was driving down a country road a mile from my house, straight ahead is a giant field with only a few houses that can see this field. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted what looked like a drone flying above the field. Nearby, a car was parked off the road, and I assumed it belonged to someone piloting that drone. As I approached a stop sign at an intersection where a dirt road branched off, the parked car pulled away. Curiosity piqued. I pulled over to the shoulder of the dirt road to get a better look. I had heard about the drone sightings in New York and New Jersey, and I've followed those stories for a while. Being obsessed with space, I hoped that maybe this drone was something special. But as I scrutinized it, it appeared to be just an ordinary drone. I turned off my car, and the sound of the drone's propellers filled the air. It hovered silently for a moment before maintaining a consistent height and gliding away in a certain direction. Eager to get its attention, I started flashing my headlights. High beams, low beams, high beams again. Pleading silently, "Please come back. I want to see more of you." As the drone momentarily vanished behind passing clouds, I decided to call my friend Rose on my laptop. I didn't have a cell phone, just my laptop connected to a jetpack Wi-Fi. Just as I began to explain what I was seeing, I noticed a light reappearing in the sky. This time, it was a white light, and it was coming back toward me. I exclaimed to Rose, "It's coming! It's coming!" To my astonishment, I saw not one, but 2 white lights in the sky. I thought, "Rose, there are 2 of them." Felt as though they were looking right at me. As I glanced down, I noticed that Rose wasn't responding, and suddenly my laptop, originally at 40% battery, shut off without warning. A wave of fear washed over me as I turned around, scanning for any other lights or vehicles in the area. The 2 lights seemed to maintain their focus on me. No longer could I hear the sound of propellers. It was eerily silent. I continued to watch as they drew closer, almost as if they were observing me. Then, one of the lights illuminated the woods briefly, resembling a camera flash or an X-ray scan, lighting up the trees for a moment before fading back into darkness. I pondered why they had done that. Perhaps it was just a passing car's headlights, I thought, but deep down, I felt something more significant was happening. As the 2 lights began to move away, I noticed they gradually got closer together, merging into one. They pulsated rhythmically, splitting apart and coming back together, almost like they were connected by an unseen force. It was a mesmerizing sight, and I couldn't tear my eyes away as they flew at a consistent height, maintaining their elevation as they moved in the same direction they had initially come from. I felt compelled to follow them, so I pulled away, keeping them in my line of sight. They flew quickly, gaining distance on me, but I continued to watch as they soared into the early night sky. The last thing I saw was the pulsating light disappearing into the horizon, leaving me in stunned silence. It was the first time my jaw had dropped in disbelief, realizing that what I had witnessed was something extraordinary. Something that had started as an ordinary drone but transformed into an inexplicable experience. When I'm telling you it was all just weird. It was a drone and then it wasn't. This happened in Cedar Springs, Michigan, the corner of Becker and Myers Lake. Time, 8:30 p.m.-ish. Location, Cedar Springs, Michigan.
My brother-in-law was on his way to Joshua Tree National Park, California recently and finally mustered up the courage to speak about this to my husband and I tonight when he came over to drop something off to my husband. He hesitated because was scared that we would think he was crazy or making things up, but he's honestly never the person to lie. He's the most trustworthy person, and in all of the time I have known him he has never once kept anything from my husband and I nor told any lies, and he has no reason to. He was genuinely so freaked out to his core, and we know he's telling the truth. He's never had this look on his face before. He was driving alone in his car to go stargaze late at night time, astronomy buff, when everything flashed and he saw a very close super bright white light hovering maybe 200 feet in front of his car. He slowed down and felt a bit freaked out but kept going, as he felt unexplainably drawn to it. As he got closer, he realized what looked to be a metallic cigar-shaped object. Once he speeded past it, he noticed that it began to slowly follow him from his rearview mirror, stopping at times before zigzagging closer and closer, as if it were stalking him like prey slowly getting ready to pounce. He said that he felt super freaked out at this point, and everything in his car suddenly felt charged with a huge amount of static electricity out of left field. All of his hair was sticking up, head, arms, entire body, and when he would touch his dashboard or other parts of the car he would get shocked. He said he felt like he was being watched and followed. He had never been so scared in his life, and immediately knew that this was not something of this earth. He went from full-on non-believer to legitimately believing that he was going to get abducted, but managed to convince himself that he was crazy during the encounter. It was as if an energy got lassoed onto his car and felt his car shaking and almost getting pulled towards the hovering object. He was struggling to get his car to move fast enough, but he finally was able to get it to stop acting weird. This is when he floored the pedal and went autobahn speeds out of there. The static electricity flowing through his entire car then slowly subsided. All night he still felt he was being followed and watched, even with the craft far out of sight and long gone. When he arrived back home, his car began locking and unlocking itself throughout the night in his garage, making the lock honk and unlock honk for hours. His keys were literally on his bedside table and he was not pressing it. He went to investigate and could actually hear and see the door locks clicking up and down. It got to the point where he bent down and checked under and around his car for any possible tracking devices, nothing. His car began doing the same thing suddenly when he was at our place telling us about it. My husband got so freaked out that he tried to end the topic of conversation. Now he is asleep and I am unable to. This freaked me out to the core, and we now genuinely believe that my BIL is currently being monitored by whatever it was he encountered that night. He's too terrified to report it as of right now. We're trying to get him to. It all happened so fast that he did not get any video evidence. He said we was on fight or flight mode and that he is still traumatized from that. We told him we knew he was telling the truth and believed him. He sighed with relief, but by the end of his story his face was pale and he looked like he had the life completely drained out of him. My husband and I also saw a bunch of fireballs hovering in the sky a few months back and have not seen that or been able to explain it since either. I don't even know what to say or do I guess other than to tell this story and tell you that this is all very super real and it's very horrifying. He's telling the truth. It's time for disclosure.
I've never made a post about my triangle encounter/sighting before. Well, I tried once, but the bot removed it for some reason. I have mentioned it in comments a couple times, but never posted it as its own stand-alone record. I just thought I would put it out there in case anyone finds it interesting. Location: Southern Oregon, on I-5 freeway/Sexton Mountain Pass, I believe. Time: fall, I think, 2010. You can ask questions, but most of what I can remember is written below. Yes, this is a trust me bro report as I have no photo or video documentation, not that anyone believes those either. Before you post something ridiculing me for this, just know that I don't really care if you are skeptical and don't believe my story. That's fine, and I think being reasonably skeptical is great. If I hadn't seen anything myself to convince me that the phenomenon is real, I would be unsure about all this as well. This post is just an effort on my part to add a data point for others like me who have seen a triangle, or other UFO/UAP, to get a little more info from my perspective. I love hearing about other triangle encounters because I am desperately trying to find more context in order to understand exactly what it was that I saw. I hope to get some answers in the coming years through legislation, but we'll see. The video I posted is an artistic representation of what I saw, and I'm proud to say that it is quite accurate aside from a couple things. The light in the middle was blinking slowly. Also, as we were directly below the triangle, it was so big that we were seeing two of the corners through the pine trees lining the side of the road. One thing I didn't realize at the time but believe to be true upon reflection is that I do not recall these lights actually illuminating the area. The white lights at the corners were extremely brilliant, and thinking back, they should have lit that whole area up like crazy. The blinking red/amber light in the middle was directly over us, and I would think it would have illuminated the area around us with that color, which I am quite sure was not the case. It's all very strange. I know someone will ask me if I had any missing time. I'm not sure. At that time I was not really versed in this topic and didn't know that was something I should be looking out for. I didn't take note of the time before or after. I will say that I believe this occurred shortly after dusk, and when we arrived at my parents' about an hour later, we excitedly told them all about it. They seemed more tired than usual and ended up going to bed shortly after. They are usually night owls and stay up really late, but this shouldn't have been late at all. Hindsight is 20/20, and I wish I took careful note of many things, but the whole experience was very strange. You'll see a little more of what I mean by this with the follow-up conversation I had with my co/experiencer. Original MUFON report I filed within days of the sighting, 2010. My roommate and I were heading down I-5, south, and we were a few miles before Grants Pass heading up a relatively steep hill when I noticed some brilliantly white lights above/near the peak of the hill. At first we only saw two bright lights because of our angle of approach, but as we got further up the hill we could see that there were three white lights in a triangular shape and one blinking amber-ish colored light in the center. We kept driving up the hill discussing what it could be, and decided that it was definitely not any sort of normal plane because it was totally still and looked to be very large. As we drove underneath it, my roommate put his head out the window and looked up and said he could barely see the outline of the object and that it was a triangle with the lights in the corners. I couldn't make out the outline because I couldn't really stick my head out the window to look up while driving. It was difficult to tell the size of this thing without much to reference it to, but just judging by how long it took to drive underneath this thing and just our perspective of it, I would say it was maybe the width of a football field or so. As we went down the other side of the hill, my roommate said it must have moved toward the way we came from because we quickly lost sight of it with the peak of the hill obstructing our view. If we could have turned around at that point on the freeway, we definitely would have, but we were in a bit of a rush and there wasn't any way to go back the other way for a few miles. I've seen UFOs a couple times before, but they were the single bright lights that move in zigzag patterns, and I never quite believed in the triangular UFOs before this sighting. I obviously believe in them now. Follow up with my friend/ex-roommate just last year. The event was strange. I remember the approach to this thing in the distance very clearly even after all this time. My buddy and I were talking about it and discussing possibilities of what it might be for at least a few minutes as we approached. It was parked directly over the freeway above the trees at the top of a mountain pass. We went directly below it. Here is the weird thing. My memory has always been very fuzzy about the departure away from this thing. I remember slowing down on the side of the road and both of us rolling the windows down to look up at it, listening for noise. As far as I can remember, we just sort of kept going and I was watching in the rear view and eventually it was just out of sight. Now things get weirder. I talked to my friend that I saw this with this year after not talking in ages, and he remembers stopping the car, actually a truck, directly below it, so we could get out and find my digital SLR camera we had in the back, but when we got out of the car it was gone. I do not remember it this way at all. Him telling me this was a shock. I actually had to dig up my old MUFON report, which I filed within a day or two after, to make sure I wasn't misremembering my account. It turns out this type of thing is quite commonly reported amongst experiencers. Two people can experience something together but have different memories of what happened. Before you ask, we were both sober. I don't know if this discrepancy implies that we were abducted and had differing screen memories implanted or what. I'm not ready to go there, and would rather just assume one of us is misremembering. I don't want to believe that I was abducted. But it's very strange and disconcerting to say the least. I know this sounds crazy and these are the parts of stories that make people call BS. But it's an event that occurred in my life. Take it or leave it. I have no choice but to try and make sense of it. Colm Kelleher had this to say about the black triangles. At NIDS we did a lengthy investigation of the black triangles. 150 cases. These things were 100 yards long, low-flying, huge, coming in over neighborhoods and interstate highways and flying at treetop level. Brightly lit and silent. After the first 10 we thought it has to be an advanced tech special access program by the Air Force. But the pilots were taking enormous risks over populated neighborhoods with experimental craft. After 100 cases we concluded they were not U.S. Air Force. Pilots were violating all safety features. It was decided the phenomenon was mimicking SAPs. We created a hypothesis, bidirectional mimicry, where the phenomenon was reflecting back to us what our advanced SAPs were doing. They were not us. But it was so confusing. Low-flying, massive black triangles. One flew over Scott Air Force Base in Illinois on January 5, 2000. 4 separate police precincts with multiple officers watched it move around. It was unbelievable.
Introduction. Please note that I will be vague in some places about any identifying information, credentials, locations, people, procedures, etc. I don't want to be identified and harassed. I have a professional background in anthropology. I also have some informal experience in philosophy, which unexpectedly ended up being the most useful of my skills on this project. Previously, I worked for a university in the western United States. For cultural reasons, students and faculty at this particular university are more likely to be selected for sensitive government work. I suspect that I was selected because of my low profile, my squeaky clean history, a lack of any drug or alcohol use, my broad range of skills and knowledge related to human civilization, and some connections that I have in academia. My most significant work has been in ethnography and cultural anthropology. Why Reddit? I'm sure you're wondering why I'm posting this here instead of sending this information somewhere more important. Since the UAP hearing happened and other whistleblowers have come forward, I felt safe enough to speak out privately. I don't know how useful my testimony was, and I felt like I was brushed off. As I'll get into later, I don't have any documents to hand over or any first-hand experience with UFOs or ETs. I do have trust in our institutions to do their job, come to the right conclusions, and eventually begin disclosure. I have a hope that the truth will be widely known in the near future. I wasn't interested in or involved in the UFO/alien phenomenon prior to starting my work. As the work progressed, I became convinced that there was something very real behind all of this, and now that I'm released from the project, ufology has become a special interest of mine. I think now is a good time to put my story out there. The work. In early 2017, I was contacted by one of my connections at the university who urged me to apply for a position in a special research project, claiming that the project needed someone with my experience, the pay would be good, and that they would help me get in. This individual helped me apply and gave me a rundown about what to expect from the hiring process. This process involved an extensive background check, applying for a security clearance, several interviews, and training for security, communication, and working with sensitive information. Going through the rat maze took several months, but I made it through much faster than anticipated and was finally ready to actually begin working in early 2018. I was apprehensive on my first day of work. I had jumped through all the hoops, and I still didn't know what the subject of the research was. I didn't feel comfortable with all the security. I'm on the spectrum, and while I'm good at masking, procedures and bureaucracy make me confused and nervous. The workday began by entering a secure facility where my identity was verified with ID and biometrics. After passing through, I would go to my workplace and have to pass through another layer of security. In the workspace, we were monitored constantly and subject to random security checks. The workspace was a medium-sized set of offices where I and 6 other researchers worked, one of which was assigned to train me. Each of these researchers had different backgrounds and were assigned to a different part of the project. Over the next few days, my trainer walked me through the research process. It was then when I finally learned what the subject of the research was. My trainer gently explained that we were working with information about an exotic intelligence, meaning a sapient non-human species of an unknown origin. Our job was to take the information that had been provided for us from outside sources, sort it based on its content and usefulness, and in the end produce a comprehensive report that summarized what we know about this intelligence, with a special focus on its motivations and intentions. This report could then be used to brief elected officials in the future, and even the public. We were allowed to make certain assumptions in the report, such as that these beings and their motivations could be understood by humans and that the information we have is accurate. I had endless questions and became distraught, and I think they could tell because my trainer figured it would be best if I was given time to myself to read some of the material and digest the information. As I learned more, the shock faded and my fear was replaced with curiosity. A lot of the work wouldn't be very interesting to the members of this sub. The average workday consisted of going through security, getting permission to retrieve certain documents, then organizing and annotating the documents. Much of the documents were only related to the subject in tangential ways and didn't convey very much of use. In a sense, we were separating the wheat from the chaff and getting the material ready to be used for the project. After finishing, we would secure the workplace and leave. Over the months that followed, we slowly built up a corpus of useful information. I obviously do not have the report with me, and it has been a while, but I will now relate to you the most important information that I can recall related to these beings. Feel free to ask questions. Note that I work the most on information related to their society and motivations. Origins. We know more about every other aspect of these beings than we do about where they actually come from. We do have some tentative ideas and speculation, but multiple hypotheses are still on the table. As I'll get into later, there is good evidence that life on Earth and these beings share a common ancestor. Our job is to keep an open mind and let the evidence lead the way instead of falling for our own pet theories or cultural prejudice. The extraterrestrial hypothesis makes some sense, but it's not the only option. During work, my colleagues often called them aliens or ETs. In the interviews I've read, the interview subjects are vague, absurd, contradictory, or evasive when asked about their origins. Perhaps this is because we aren't in a position to understand where they come from, or perhaps there are problems with communication. Maybe they simply don't want us to know. Appearance and biology. In regards to the appearance of the ETs, UFO mythology is dead on. Generally, they look like diminutive humanoids with large heads, reduced facial features, and very large eyes, which are sometimes covered in a transparent black film. Earlier specimens usually do not have the film, later specimens do. Their average height is 5 feet tall. They have 2 long arms and 2 legs. They have 3 long fingers and an opposable thumb. They have feet with 4 toes. They may have fingernails and toenails, but not always. When they do, they are mottled and dark. They have no reproductive organs or anus, and they secrete waste through their skin, similar to how we sweat. They ingest liquid food just like we do. They wear clothing, usually in the form of a very thin blue or gray high-collared garment, as well as boots. Their heads are large, as mentioned before. In some individuals there are pronounced ridges on the head and upper back, which seem to relate to different kinds of implants in a way that is not understood. As far as we can tell, every individual has an artificial lattice woven through their brain and nervous system. I'll get into that later. No 2 individuals look exactly alike. Head shape, eye shape and size, the patterns and protrusion of the ridges, and skin color vary between individuals. Life on Earth and the ETs share the same kind of biochemistry. They are made of cells, use DNA, proteins, etc. They can be studied and understood with the same principles that we use to study life on Earth. This has fed into speculation about their origins. The most conservative hypothesis is that they share our biochemistry because they also originate from Earth, but there are other theories. Life on Earth and wherever they come from could both be descended from a common ancestor. Perhaps life everywhere in the universe shares the same biochemistry. The striking similarities between their anatomy and human anatomy leads me to wild speculation about whether the individuals we see are specifically designed to resemble humans in order to facilitate interaction. There is a small collection of biological material that has been retrieved from craft that shares no resemblance to humans and defies description. This material is like a web of nervous tissue which is interlaced into the structure of the craft itself. Technology. Before, I mentioned an artificial lattice which is integrated into the nervous system. This lattice is at the heart of their technology. In interviews with subjects, they demonstrated the ability to communicate with and detect the presence of others of their kind in the same facility, in different rooms. Tools retrieved from craft would be responsive to the touch and intentions of the ETs, but would be totally inert in the hands of human operators. This lattice is probably what makes these abilities possible. It is made of ordinary elements like copper and aluminum, and there is no discernible reason why it should be able to do what it seems to do. We were allowed access to documents that describe the capabilities of their craft as well as eyewitness encounters, but we were not allowed any data that would explain how their propulsion systems work or about anything regarding the reverse engineering of craft. The reasoning behind this is obvious. The special interests involved have begrudgingly begun to accept that disclosing the existence of the intelligence is necessary over the long term, but the one thing they refuse to do is relinquish their monopoly over exotic technology. I don't have much insight to give about the craft because the project focused more on the extraterrestrials themselves, their society, and implications for our society. The craft have a wide range of appearance, size, and behavior. It seems like each craft is designed for a specific purpose. Every craft is different, but they can be grouped based on shape and purpose. There are some edge cases that won't fit into this neat categorization. There are hundreds of objects in orbit that are likely created by this intelligence. At first glance, they look like commonplace space debris, but on rare occasions they will move in a way that is not attributable to gravity, meet with another object, or expel an object. Tracking these is very difficult, and we know very little about them, including their size. The most commonly seen objects are large reflective orbs or pills that move at high speeds. Usually they are only seen for a second, but on other occasions they follow aircraft, hover over sensitive locations, move in strange, illogical ways, and even suddenly disappear. At night these orbs sometimes emit orange light, although other colors can also be seen. These objects have been seen submerging into the ocean as well as other bodies of water. There are egg-shaped craft which move in more predictable ways, although they move much faster than man-made aircraft. We were allowed to have a lot of information related to these. These craft are the most likely to fail, and they are manned. Biological material and even living organisms have been recovered from these craft. These are the most interesting to me, as they contain occupants, living spaces, and large rooms full of equipment. We speculate that these are surveyors or scientists. In one particular case, a craft of this kind contains samples of Earth biota. There are no control panels or any kind of obvious mechanism for controlling the craft. This kind of craft has unfortunately become more uncommon over time. The classic flying discs and crescents have the greatest presence in popular culture, but they are not the most common object. These are speculated to be stealth vehicles that are used for reconnaissance and research. On many occasions these have landed, completely empty. The interviews. Because of my past work experience, most of my work on the report was related to actual interviews that had taken place with ETs. They were retrieved from crashes but also from landings, where the craft seemed to have landed on purpose and the beings came voluntarily. Reading these was very surreal, and I suspect the context of these interviews is part of the reason for so much secrecy. The way that they were treated was inhumane and very unethical. The ETs have a very close relationship with their technology. They cannot survive very long while separated from their craft and from each other. They can't eat anything other than a special kind of liquid food, and human-made substitutes were not sufficient replacements. Throughout their stay on Earth, they would suffer from malnutrition and a kind of toxic buildup in the body. Because of how valuable they were, every effort was taken to keep them alive and conscious, even against their wishes. The situation reminded me of the case of Hisashi Aoki. Something that deeply frustrated me was that they seemed to want to show us so much more, but because of the irresponsible behavior of the program, they could not. They were separated from their craft permanently so the craft could be hauled off elsewhere and auctioned off, and so that the program would have total control over the interview process. Because of this separation, the ETs would slowly die. Communication took place through telepathy. They can read our thoughts and send thoughts and impressions into our minds. However, this takes a lot of concentration on the part of the interviewer, and communication would break down as the health and consciousness of the subject declined. The interviewer and the ET would communicate telepathically, then the interviewer would say the exchange out loud for it to be recorded. Society and motivations. From reading interviews with detained subjects, I and other researchers were able to put together a rough picture of how this species works and why they are here. Instead of having any kind of formal social structure, these beings form a dynamic superintelligence that is a composite of all of their minds. Reproduction doesn't take place biologically, instead they are artificially created, with each one designed for a specific purpose as their society has need. The intimate interlinking of their minds causes them to behave as one superorganism rather than individuals. To get into why they are here, we have to understand their philosophy. Philosophy is a human word made for human contexts, so it may not be appropriate to use that label, but I will use it anyway. They have a monistic, reductionist ontology which bears heavy similarities to cosmopsychism or objective idealism. As far as I can tell, their philosophy is naturalistic but has some elements that could be misconstrued as religious. They reduce time, space, and everything to the behavior of a single unitary consciousness. Not to be confused with the superintelligence that I mentioned earlier. This consciousness behaves entirely spontaneously, without deliberation or forethought. According to them, the minds of living organisms are parts of this consciousness that has looped in on itself, creating separation and individuality. The process of evolution has caused some organisms, such as ourselves, to develop higher cognitive faculties and mental complexity which allows for complex thought and self-reflection. Our perceptions are the mental activity of this unitary consciousness as it is filtered through our minds and presented in a way that is most advantageous to our survival as individual loops. We model the patterns of our observations as the laws of physics, but the laws of physics have no inherent existence except as the patterns of this universal mental activity. They believe that as life continues to grow and complexify, it will have an effect on the unitary consciousness that constitutes the universe. As life proliferates and complexifies, it will cause it to attain higher cognitive functions and eventually reach self-awareness. They believe that the universe is already blindly striving towards self-awareness and complexity, and they seek to move it along, so to speak. This is their goal, and it's presumably why they are here on Earth. They are guiding the development of life on this planet to help serve this end. I have no clue why they are so motivated to move toward this goal or what the actual implications would be if they succeeded. It also leads to other questions. If any of this is true, time itself is merely a construct created by this unitary consciousness, so how could it change and develop? How does this universal consciousness fragment into individual minds, and what relationship does this have to biology and the origin of life? They are not afraid of dying because they believe that death is just a process where individuality breaks down and the mind unloops and becomes reintegrated into the unitary consciousness. They believe that memories and life experiences are reabsorbed into the consciousness during this process. Perhaps this is the mechanism that allows it to develop. Whether or not this is true, it seemed to bring them a lot of peace during their tormented final moments. Even in death, they served their purpose. Their philosophy shapes the way their society is organized in profound ways. They have intentionally designed their technology in a way that integrates the mind and obscures individuality. They do not fear death, and even embrace it when they have fulfilled their purpose. They have a positive attitude toward living organisms and ecosystems, because the flourishing of life is integral to them achieving their goals. However, they do not respect individuality, and they see individuals, including themselves, and species as expendable in the service of their goals. In the interviews, they voice concern with the impact that humanity is having on life on this planet, but also see us as a step in a process of complexification. They are definitely monitoring how life is developing on this planet, and it is very probable that they are subtly manipulating it to serve their goals. The similarity between their biology and ours makes me wonder whether they seeded Earth with life to begin with. Maybe this planet has been their project from the beginning. My thoughts on disclosure. I've been keeping up with this topic for a while now, and despite recent events, I feel very optimistic about disclosure. This isn't the kind of thing that can be kept a secret forever. They are here to stay, and a secret this large can only be kept for so long. None of the information, at least none that I learned during the project, is anything that would threaten civilization or cause a mass panic. People are much more resilient than that. The cat is clawing its way out of the bag, and I don't think it's going to be forced back in without tremendous effort. The important thing is that ordinary people like you keep putting up resistance and support whistleblowers. I hope that the report I helped to write eventually gets out to the public. Me and my coworkers put a lot of effort into writing it.
It was April 2nd, 2007, around 9:30 p.m. I was coming out of Orlando, Florida on the 408W at about exit 12 or 11. I saw a red light reflecting off the buildings and thought it was funny because of how high up it was, and thought maybe it was some emergency lights. I saw between the two buildings a red, pulsating light that was enveloped in what looked to be a plasma shield. My best way of describing it would be a red blood cell, complete with plasma membrane. I had a funny thought pop in my head, so that's what you are, when it turned to its left and came up very quickly upon me in my minivan which I was driving alone. It proceeded to come about 20 to 30 feet in front of and slightly above the van windshield. It pulsated a deep red, and when the inner sphere would light up the plasma, outer clearish sphere would catch the light. The inner sphere reminded me of a front-loader washing machine. It was not a solid glowing red sphere, but instead seemed to be a red light liquid was washing around. There was an inner yellow light liquid with some white in the very center. It was very bright inside, and this white light peeking through caused the red color to really light up, making it appear, if you were further away, that it was simply pulsating a red light. So strange. As I am watching this, I realized the plasma is dematerializing. The center red pulsating ball of light started to spin from right to left and stretch, and it grew wings. Plane wings. It looked a lot like a drone plane, complete with a silvery finish and what looked like a cockpit. However, there was no tail end to speak of. The outer sphere was now completely gone. It was facing me as I was driving at a constant speed of 75 mph. I had cruise control on. On each wingtip there was a light, one yellow, the other white, blinking on and off, back and forth. At the underbelly was the same red ball of liquid light, still blinking. It seemed wobbly. The best way to describe it would be if you held a baton at the middle and made figure eights with your wrist. It would be that motion. I remember looking back at one point to see if other cars were around me, because I noticed the cars all in front of me had pretty well taken off. In my rearview mirror, I saw cars were also far behind me. I was alone. Not moments later, after looking, a police cruiser with lights flashing but no siren came up from my left and almost sideswiped my van, coming in between myself and the craft drone plane look-alike. The craft was directly above the hood of the police cruiser. The craft responded to this by veering off to the right. I watched as it grew, for better of lack of a term, a spotlight that I believe was behind the red light, and as it had flown up to this brick building, it shined a light on a window on it. I tried to watch it as it flew away, and I kinda wanted it to come back, but I lost sight of it. I lost sight of the police cruiser too. I kinda really wanted him to pull me over, just so I could talk with someone else about what I'd just seen. Somewhere that cop is out there, and she saw it too.
I am a 57 years old who served in the Air Force for 12 years. The occurrence I am going to describe happened 37 years ago in the middle of the Mojave Desert. I haven't shared this story with many people and didn't think it was worth sharing until tonight. I have no reason to use a burner account because I am too irrelevant, and whether anyone chooses to believe me or not, this is a true account of what happened that night. Outside of Victorville, California, there used to be a military base called George AFB. I was stationed there. On weekends when we had the time, we would make a run for Antelope Valley after we got off shift on Fridays. a hop across the desert of about 60 miles NW. In between were old two-lane roads that ran past a dry lake bed and desert that dropped down into a valley beyond a strip of nothing ironically named Lake Los Angeles. There was no lake, nor was it anywhere near Los Angeles. The run was triangulated between Edwards AFB, to the northwest, Air Force Plant 42, in Palmdale, and George AFB, near Victorville. I don't know what it is like out there now, but back then there were no street lights or buildings illuminated once you got out past El Mirage. Beyond Lake Los Angeles, the roads dropped down into a valley that on a clear night you could see at least 60 to 70 miles away. On this particular fall night, my roommates SGTH and SGTL, and I, decided to make a run across the desert in an old Capri with a sunroof. The air was still warm and the night was clear, the stars incredible. As we crested the ridge past Lake Los Angeles, we saw what appeared to be several helicopters off in the distance searching for something in the valley. We stopped in the middle of the deserted road and just hung out trying to figure out what they were looking for. We came to the conclusion that another aircraft must have gone down in the area and there was a SAR effort going on. We debated as to whether or not to continue down into the valley because the deserted road we were on went right through the center of where the helicopters were searching. We had surmised they were helicopters because of the way they would hover over a spot and then move slowly with the spot. After maybe 5 minutes of watching, we decided we would keep driving down into the valley. As we dropped down maybe 500 to 700 feet in elevation, we kept watching the activity in front of us, which seemed to be several miles away. The elevation at which they were flying had also seemed to drop. They were maybe 50 feet off the deck. We could now count at least 4 spread out in formation, dropping individual spotlights on the desert. We continued forward maybe a couple of miles slowly when Sergeant H stopped the car for a second time and shut it off completely. He told us to be quiet and said, "Listen. There is no sound." As the object slowly moved closer, maybe a mile away, sure enough, the familiar chuff 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 sound of rotors was completely absent. Stealth helicopters. Possibly with skunkworks 40 miles west of us across the desert. Whatever they were, my heart jumped into my throat and I felt the sudden urge to urinate myself. This was what I would come to understand years later as my first panic attack. Sergeant H, who was driving, and Sergeant L, who was in the passenger seat, was now sitting halfway outside the vehicle out of the windows. I was standing straight up through the sunroof. As the lights drew nearer to us, a 5th spotlight dropped down maybe 3/4 mile directly in front of us onto the road. This lasted no more than a few seconds and shut back off. The intensity of these lights seemed much brighter the closer they came to us. Then, suddenly, all of the lights went off. No sound, no hum, no nothing. As our eyes adjusted to the sudden darkness, something became very apparent. The nose of a very large object was approaching us, and the spotlights weren't separate aircraft but were all underneath this enormous object. What we thought was the dark horizon of the desert with the stars behind it, was in fact the entirety of this single object. We didn't scream, run, or drive off like a bat out of hell. Instead, we just stayed there as the object passed over us, holding our jaws in our hands, so to speak. It seemed as though it took several minutes for the object to pass over us, and at one point sections seemed no more than 10 to 12 feet above us. I remember reaching up to it and almost being able to touch it with my hands. I had now climbed halfway out of the sunroof in an effort to get closer. The surface seemed to be blacker than the surrounding night, blacker than anything I had ever experienced. The interior glow of the car was enough light to illuminate the underside as it passed. That's how close it was. It wasn't completely smooth, there seemed to be panel sections, not just one smooth skin. And something else. I vaguely remember seeing markings on the underside. Our markings. As the object passed completely over us, it continued to spot the desert till it reached the rise and then disappeared completely. Let me say that again. We could make out a shape, and then, it was gone. This enormous object didn't rise up into the sky and take off, it just vanished. It wasn't there anymore. I don't recall any conversations with my roommates about this, although I know we had a lot about them that night. I haven't spoken with Sergeant H since he got out a year after this and went to work as a civilian for Lockheed. SGTL and I spoke a few times over the years, but not about this. She also got out and went on to work at JPL as a crew chief on drones for NASA out of Edwards. As for me, no one could have seen the wars to come, and the confusion the world would fall into. This incident got drowned out by the Gulf War, 9/11, Afghanistan and Iraq, and so many other seemingly desperate times. But as I got older, this story re-emerged after spending 12 weeks in intensive trauma therapy through the VA. I cannot say for sure that the markings were indeed ours. But when I think back to this incident, I am stuck with the memory of seeing this. My head may make me remember this because it's what I needed to see to make it seem rational. I believe we didn't speak about it because we thought perhaps we had experienced some top-secret tech, and we all were bound by security clearances that would keep us from discussing this. As I said, I am irrelevant. But this story is true. After SGTH and SGTL both got out, I made another drive in the middle of the night across that desert. As I crested the same ridge, I saw the brightest green laser shoot up toward the sky and into the stars. A few seconds later, another laser answered. From the stars, and back to the desert.
Thanks for watching. If you want to hear more stories like these, please like and subscribe.